James Michener, one of the best-selling authors of the 20th century, when he was a very old man, wrote his memoirs. And when he started them, he remembered an event from his childhood, and this is actually how the event is written out. He said, the farmer living at the end of our land had an aging apple tree that had once been abundantly productive, but had now lost its energy and ability to bear any fruit at all. The farmer, on an early spring day, I remember, hammered 8 nails, long and rusty, into the trunk of the tree. 4 were knocked in close to the ground on 4 different sides of the trunk, 4 higher up and well spaced out about the circumference. That autumn, a miracle happened. That tired old tree, having been goaded back to life, produced a bumper crop of juicy red apples, bigger and better than they had ever seen before. When I asked how this had happened, the farmer explained. He said, hammering in the rusty nails gave it a shock to remind it that its job was to produce apples. So I asked him, was it important that the nails were rusty? And he said, maybe it was the minerals in the nails that made it easier to digest. Then I asked him, was 8 important? And he said, if you're going to send a message, make sure it's heard. Then he said, could you do the same thing next year? And he said, a substantial jolt lasts about 10 years. Such an interesting story. See, pain is nails hammered into a tree, and nails always come. Job 5:6 says, for hardship does not spring from the soil, nor does trouble sprout from the ground. Yet man is born to trouble as surely as sparks fly upward. Have you ever just sat and looked at a campfire before? You just watch feel the warmth and the light emanating and the wood, burning and crackling and splitting. And if you watch it long enough, it can be mesmerizing. If you watch it long enough, you'll notice that these little flares of light just fly up over and over and over again. Just little embers flying up because heat causes things to rise, flies up into the air until they lose their heat. That those sparks flying upward, Job says, is an image of what trouble is like in our lives, that it's inevitable. As surely as those sparks fly upward, man encounters trouble on the earth. And in the last 10 to 15 years that I have been in ministry, I unfortunately have seen my own fair share of sparks. I've seen children deal with chronic conditions that have required years of care and treatment that have stolen away their quality of life. I've seen good men ravaged by cancer and die before getting to meet their grandchildren. I've seen families lose. One example, I saw a family lose their 18-year-old son in a drunk driving accident one fateful night. His whole life ahead of him gone now. I sometimes wonder if there's such thing as a pain-o-meter, meaning if all of human sorrow could be measured like we measure the depths of the ocean, how large would the sea of human sorrow be? Again, Job laments in chapter 6, verse 2. He says, if only my anguish could be weighed and all of my misery be placed on the scales, it would surely outweigh the sand of the seas. No wonder my words have been impetuous. The arrows of the Almighty are in me. My spirit drinks in their poison. That was Job's experience with the amount of the weight of sorrow and hardship that he experienced, that it was almost like God was shooting arrows, poisonous arrows at him. Has anyone ever felt like that before? See, we're continuing in this series called Asking for a Friend, and we're looking at some of these tough questions that, for various reasons, people have a hard time asking. Sometimes they're embarrassed because they feel like, I've been following Jesus a long time. I feel like I should already know the answer to this question, so I'm too embarrassed to ask. Or honestly, maybe like a question like this, the question's a little too painful to speak out loud, and so you don't say anything. Last week, Darren talked about whether or not we could trust the Bible, if the Bible was reliable and we could trust it. And he did an amazing job. It's a really, really good message. Highly recommend to jump on our website and check that message out. Super good. Very powerful topic. But today, we're going to talk about an age-old question that has literally been discussed for millennia. And it is, why is there so much pain and suffering in the world? But not just in the world. Why is there so much pain and suffering in my life? Why do I experience that? And I got to be honest, I was not totally sure where to go with this message at first, because there's several different ways you could go, several different paths you can take when talking about pain and suffering. You can take the more apologetic route that tries to give answers that are more black and white in their delivery with a topic that is very, varied shades of gray. That would mean discussing things like free will, the fact that we are all autonomous, freely choosing individuals, and the nature of pain and suffering is inevitable whenever you have a world full of autonomous choosing individuals, because it is just a matter of time before my will conflicts with somebody else's will, and oftentimes there is conflict or pain or sorrow that results with the confliction of wills. But the truth is, many of the woes in our life are our own choosing. It is true. There is a sense in which our own decisions have played a part in the things we go through. We make decisions that bring about misery and suffering in ourselves. And so, just to give you an example, just quick show of hands on this one. I promise this is a judgment-free zone. Do not feel bad about answering this question. How many of you have gotten a speeding ticket before? Look at all those sinners. Oh, no, judgment-free. Sorry. Now, when you got the ticket, did anybody, I know I was raising my hand because I've gotten a speeding ticket before too. How many of you, when you got that ticket, you immediately responded, why me? There are so many other worse drivers out there. Why am I the one that's getting caught and getting a ticket? Well, the answer to the why me question is still because you were speeding. It's a natural consequence. It doesn't matter how you compare to someone else. You broke the law. See, sometimes we bring suffering on ourselves by our choices. They're just simply the consequences of our actions. Or sometimes, and this is, again, where wills begin to conflict, is that sometimes suffering we experience is a result of the freely chosen, decisions of another person that has been forced on me, and I suffer the consequences of their decisions. So that's one way that you could go with it. Of course, then you could talk about just the existence of evil in the world to explain why there is pain and suffering. The fact is, the Bible makes it very clear, there is an enemy called Satan or the devil or Lucifer who is called the enemy of your soul. Jesus actually said that his entire reason for existing is to steal, kill, and destroy. He is hell-bent on making your life as miserable and as suffering-filled as possible. 1 Peter 5:8, Peter says, your enemy, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion looking for someone to devour. He is looking for opportunities to ruin our lives and bring about human misery and suffering. So it makes sense now when you hear that, not that it makes it better, but at least explains why there are people who are willing to sell others, sometimes children, into sex slavery. It makes sense why people want to get into planes and crash them into buildings, killing thousands. Evil exists. It is alive and a well in the world. But of course, we can chalk up all our suffering to our choices, or the devil made me do it, or, things like that. But at the end of the day, there are still questions. That those answers don't always explain everything of why human misery exists in the world. I'll give you another example. In 2004, there was an earthquake under the Indian Ocean. It unleashed the amount of energy equivalent to 550 million times the bomb that was dropped in Hiroshima. 550 million times that energy was released by this earthquake at the bottom of the Indian Ocean, caused this huge tidal wave in the South Pacific that led to over 250,000 people being killed in the days to follow. And all of those people, they're far away, separated from us. I remember being in college and hearing about it. All of those people were someone's son and someone's daughter or someone's mother or someone's father, and they all had hopes, they all had dreams, they all had aspirations, and for no other reason than an earthquake, their lives were snuffed out in a moment. Is it possible to believe, and this is, in the days that followed, the fallout of that tsunami, online and in forums and in newspapers, people are asking these questions. Is it possible, to believe in a God who is all loving meaning that he wants what is good, and all powerful, meaning that he is able to make what is good? Is it possible to believe in a God like that in a world filled with so much suffering and so much evil? Why do things happen like that, not just in the world, because that often separates it from us, but why does stuff like that happen to me? Why does that happen in my life? Archibald MacLeish, he wrote a play about the life of Job, and he had this one single line in the play that explains the problem of pain in the most interesting way that I've ever heard. This is what he writes in this one single line. He says, if God is good, he is not God. If God is God, he is not good. He captured the problem of pain in that one sentence. And it's striking to me that the book that is most troubled with pain and sorrow is the Bible, because the Bible is the book that probably has the most to say about trouble and suffering and pain. In fact, if you look at the makeup of the Bible, really only the first 2 chapters at the very beginning are about life before suffering. And then the final chapter at the very end of it in Revelation is about life post-suffering. And every other chapter in between is about suffering. It is a topic that is inescapable, is inevitable for our lives. And it's an ironic topic, especially in our culture, because of medicine and technology and wealth. We have reduced many forms of suffering in our lives, and that's a good thing. That is not a bad thing. We live longer, we live healthier, we live cleaner, safer, more educated, and more affluent lives. But the dark side of that progress is that it often feeds the illusion that somehow we are in control of our suffering. Often we want to make sense of it, because if we think, if I can make sense of my suffering or I can avoid it, then somehow I can control it. In fact, a great example of this is if people hear about someone diagnosed with lung cancer, what is the first question that they ask? Did he smoke? We ask that question because we tell ourselves, well, I can just not smoke and avoid lung cancer. And we can apply it to anything. I can just parent better and my kids will turn out the way I want. I can just work harder and I won't have to suffer vocational pain. I can just adopt a healthy lifestyle and then I won't lose my health. And it's funny because we suffer far less in our world today than in the ancient world, but we fear suffering far more than those did in the ancient world. So interesting. See, in the ancient world, by contrast, part of wisdom was cultivating this awareness that suffering is it's inevitable. It's a part of life. As surely as sparks fly upward, man encounters trouble in this world, and they just knew it. And they accepted it. See, in the ancient world, they knew about suffering, even as recently as the medieval period. I'm not even going all the way back to the time of Jesus. Even in the medieval period, did you know that only 1 in 5 children, make sure I get this right, 20% of all children did not reach their first birthday. 1 in 5 kids that were born didn't even live to 1. 50% of all children did not live to the age of 10. The average life expectancy was 35. I'm 35. And see, I would guess, and it's just a hunch, but I would guess that those people loved their children just as much as we love our children, right? Can you imagine 1 in 5 kids not living to 1, 50% of them not living to 10? Suffering was just a part of life. But they had a worldview at that time that made sense of suffering far better than most of us do in our day. When we think that we can control our suffering with technology, or we can somehow outlaw it, prevent it with legislation. In fact, one of the greatest questions, I heard a pastor talking about this. He said, one of the greatest questions that you can ask about any worldview is, what does this worldview say to the suffering individual? And we're living in a world now where secular humanism, the belief that, the only thing that is real, the only thing that is, exists is what we can see and taste and touch and feel and measure. Nothing beyond that exists. It's naturalism. Only things that we can naturally see and touch and measure exist. In a secular worldview has a very specific thing to say to those who are suffering. And the person who probably represents that background the best is a man named Richard Dawkins, biologist and atheist, and he uses this phrase to describe the message of secularism. This is what he writes. He says, in a universe of electrons and selfish genes, blind forces, and genetic replication, some people are going to get hurt, other people are going to get lucky, and you won't find any rhyme or reason in it, nor any justice. Can you imagine saying that to a young child who is dying of cancer? I don't know what to tell you. Some people get lucky. Not you, though. No hope, no rhyme, no reason, no justice. But see, that's not the Christian worldview. See, the Christian worldview doesn't just believe that despair is bad. It doesn't just believe that despair is unpleasant. It believes that despair is wrong. It is incorrect. It is false. It is based on a false view of the world and the universe. C.S. Lewis points out this fact, saying that human longing itself shows, the fact that humans long for things like justice and for, hope and for life beyond this one shows that there must be some sort of fulfillment to that in some way. His response was this. He said, if we find ourselves with a desire that nothing in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that we were made for another world. And that's the strange thing about suffering. Suffering points us beyond ourselves. We often try to numb our pain because this is how our society responds to pain and hardship and things like that. We try to numb our pain with work, with shopping, with comfort foods, with forbidden websites, with a few too many drinks. And that's the thing about it is every single addiction begins with an escape from pain, every single one. And in the same way, every single addiction ends with an enslavement to that same pain. Everyone. So we often try to hide our pain. And my wife actually wrote a blog post not long ago where she was talking about the difference between self-indulgence and self-care. That self-indulgence are these practices that I bring into my life. Like if I have a hard day, then, man, I just want to sit down and I just want to watch TV, or I just want to lose myself in, this thing or that thing. And it's not about getting better. It's just about getting by. I'm numbing myself. I'm distracting myself from my pain or my stress. I'm not actively dealing with it. I'm actually actively running from it. Whereas self-care is a way of attending my soul unto God, of saying, I'm going to engage in these practices that I know will actually fill me up, that maybe in some ways will help me address whatever is going on head on, to not run from it, to not numb myself from it, to get better rather than get bitter. They look similar, but they're very, very different from each other. So, how should we view suffering then? How do we answer this huge question? Is it possible for me to answer this question in full totality this morning? Probably not. Great example that I heard that I feel like captures at least what I'm going to attempt to do here is, I heard someone say this once, that the difference between the way we talk about God versus the truth about God himself is the difference between a finger pointing at the moon and the moon itself. And so I'm here to tell you today that me talking about this topic and trying to talk about what the Bible says about pain and suffering and how we should view it is a finger pointing at the moon. It is not the moon itself. It's meant to point you beyond this, beyond me, beyond this discussion. And so my hope for you is that you keep asking, that you keep seeking, even beyond what I talk about today, that you not be satisfied, and you move forward and continue to wonder and continue to ponder and continue to seek, because Jesus promises that for those who seek, they will find. And so today, what I want to do for the rest of our time in this message is I want to look at a story about a man who endured great suffering, probably more suffering than most of us will ever endure in our lives, and yet he responded to it in a way that I still, after all these years of reading this story over and over again, I still cannot fathom responding in this story the way that he did. Genesis chapter 37 through chapter 50 recounts the story of a man named Joseph. Now, Joseph was the youngest of a very large family. He was actually the son of Jacob, the grandson of Isaac, the great-grandson of Abraham, so like the patriarchs. He's kind of the fourth generation. And really interesting story because even though he was the youngest, he was the favorite. of the family, and everybody knew he was the favorite. He was openly and without reservation treated like the favorite, was even given like a special coat that had special colors on it so he could walk around and just kind of like everybody knew he was the one who was most favored. And what made the situation worse was that he was oblivious to being the favorite, did not realize it, was not aware of it, was not aware of all the hatred that all of his other brothers had toward him. So much hatred that grew for so long that they actually planned to kill him. What they were going to do is kill him, smear the coat with blood, and then tell their father he was killed by a wild animal in the wilderness. That was going to be the story. But then one of their brothers had mercy, and I say the word mercy in the most ironic way possible, because he had mercy and said, no, we can't do this wrong thing and kill him. Let's sell him into slavery instead. Don't kill him, sell him into slavery. Because mercy is selling someone into slavery, apparently. And so they do. They leave him in a well. They have these traders come and sell him into Egyptian slavery. Now, of course, over the period of time, he begins to rise in the ranks, even to where he has a certain amount of authority where he's at in the kind of system where he was working. He actually did really well and rose in it. But eventually, he was falsely accused by someone of some kind of inappropriate behavior. And because of that, he gets thrown in jail. So even the little bit of a life he had etched out for himself, that disappears too because of an unjust, unrighteous accusation. And so then he's in jail. Years go by. Eventually, through just the workings of God, and Joseph has an opportunity to interpret a dream for Pharaoh. And by interpreting rightly, he ends up getting elevated eventually to the part to where he is the number 2 in the entire nation. This is about a 15-year process for him to get here. He starts this process as a teenager and ends it as a young man, as the second most powerful person in Egypt. And then, of course, lo and behold, a famine comes into the land. And everybody's coming and begging and trying to buy food because they were the only ones who foresaw the famine and prepared for it. And lo and behold, who should appear in front of Joseph but his brothers, the ones who sold him into slavery? And you'd think this is the moment of perfect karma or perfect justice where the tables have turned and he can finally get his revenge. And see how he responds in Genesis 45. Joseph said to his brothers, I am Joseph. Is my father still living? Because they didn't recognize him because it had been 15 years. But his brothers were not able to answer because they were terrified at his presence. I probably would be too, realizing the person I thought I sold into slavery had power over my life. Then Joseph said to his brothers, come close to me. When they had done so, he said, I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. That God sent me ahead of you. For 2 years now there has been famine in the land, and for the next 5 years there will be no plowing and reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. That is how Joseph viewed the last 15 years of slavery and unjust incarceration, just unrighteous stuff. And he said, God made this happen. God sent me ahead of you so there could be a great deliverance. How in the world could someone respond like that? Like, I think about my own girls, like they breathe on each other and accuse each other of murder. Like there's no love in the midst of that. I mean, they're just ruthless toward each other. It's in us to do that. But Joseph was willing to overlook that his brothers sold him into slavery and ruined his life. So how did he do that? See, I really believe that there is a deep need in our suffering for people to see good come out of that suffering. I think we have a desire for that to happen. Not so much that it can be explained, but that we can almost, in a way, see it redeemed. A parent who loses a child to a drug overdose wants to help other parents who experience the same thing. A mom who loses a child to a drunk driver starts an organization to make sure that type of thing will never happen again. Someone who has overcome addiction goes to school to become a counselor so that they can help others find freedom from the same thing that enslaved them. I think we all have this choice when we're faced with suffering and with pain, and it's a very simple question. Am I going to get bitter or am I going to get better? Am I going to run to God or am I going to run away from God? And I've got to be honest, I've seen both of these extremes over and over again, and there's really no in between. In the midst of suffering, I don't see people kind of run to God. They either want nothing to do with him at all, or they run desperately to him with arms wide open. You either cling to God or you push him away. And in Joseph's story, you see him overcome insurmountable odds and run toward God in the midst of his pain and joy. Even the names, I love this so much. Even the names of his children speak of this. Genesis 41, it says, Joseph named his firstborn Manasseh and said, "It is because God has made me forget all of my trouble and all of my father's household." Manasseh means to forget. The second son he named Ephraim, and he said, "It is because God has made me fruitful in the land of my suffering." Ephraim means to be fruitful. Can you imagine coming to the place that you are able to not only forget your trouble, but also to be fruitful in your suffering? Joseph did. And that's why he responded to his brothers as he did in this great amount of grace and this great amount of mercy, even in the midst of his pain, which was really not that far off in the past. And of course, as the story goes on, eventually, he brings all of them down, moves them into the land because the famine's going to last for a while. And eventually, Jacob, their father, dies. And all the brothers have an epiphany moment where they realize, okay, I know what's going on now. He didn't want to grieve his father by paying us back so he would have to see all of his sons be killed. But Dad is dead now, and now so are we. He was just biding his time. We made him go through all of that. Now he made us go through this. But the way he responds, he speaks to it, Genesis 50:19. But Joseph said to them, "Don't be afraid." And then he asks this question, which I feel like is the filter that we have to think about all of this, suffering, pain, why it's in the world, all this stuff, through the lens of this question. Am I in the place of God? That's what Joseph said. Am I in the place of God? Because we often experience suffering and experience pain and see things in the world, and we automatically assume we understand what's going on. We understand why it happened, or what the purposes of it is, or we understand why God allowed it to happen, or we assume that, God is not powerful enough to stop it and that he just doesn't care. We assume we know the truth of the situation. But Joseph has this humility where he says, am I in the place of God? No. There's an implicit no to that. He says, you intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So then don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children. And he reassured them and spoke kindly to them. I read this story and I think, how? How do you get to the point that you can respond in that way to circumstances so incredibly terrible? I mean, part of the answer I want to say is I really believe it's an act of grace, that it's a work of grace of God in our hearts, that left to ourselves, we will not necessarily do that, but it has to be God working through us for that type of response. Because Joseph gets to the point to where he views his years of isolation and hardship not as punishment, but as preparation for what God is going to do, even though all those years he had no idea what it was going to be, but he trusted. And of course, no one knows this idea better than Jesus. See, we often forget that Jesus himself knew suffering his entire life. Isaiah 53, the prophet Isaiah, in this chapter, he kind of waxes philosophical about this Messiah, this Savior who would come, who would suffer on behalf of the people. And one of the descriptions in verse 3, it says, he was despised and rejected by mankind, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. And see, this is what's interesting about the teachings of Jesus is, and you can look at all the Gospels, look at all the teachings. Nowhere does Jesus ever promise that we won't go through suffering. all he promises is that he will go through suffering with us. And there's never been anyone who did this like Jesus, ever. He suffered with lepers. He wept over lost people. He listened to the scandal-ridden and showed compassion on the doubters. He suffered rejection and mockery and humiliation on behalf of all the sinners. And the place of his ultimate suffering, of course, was the cross. Suffering from sin and guilt and death, but also suffering with you and I. See, we often wonder in the midst of our pain and our sorrow and our hardship, where is God? Where is God at? He's on the cross. Nails pounded into a tree, but first nailed through the hands of God. See, only Jesus revealed to us what no human has ever imagined before, and that is a wounded God, a broken God, a scarred God, a suffering God. And we think oftentimes in our hardships that, God doesn't get it. He doesn't understand me. He doesn't know what I'm going through. He hasn't experienced what I've experienced. I think there's a reason that in the resurrection, Jesus still had the scars on his hands to remind us, I get it. I went through it. I didn't just suffer for you. I suffered with you. And I understand. See, those nails in that tree would reveal something about God and his heart that would change our perspective on all things. Because the movement of Jesus, it was started with two key moments: ultimate suffering at the crucifixion and then ultimate hope at the resurrection. The reason Jesus and those who followed him were, able to endure sufferings and persecutions previously, unknown to humanity was because they knew a hope that was previously unknown to humanity. And it shifted how they saw the world. It changed literally everything for them. So much so that someone like the Apostle Paul in 2 Corinthians 4:16 could say this. He says, "Therefore, we do not lose heart." In the midst of suffering and pain, it's easy to lose heart. He says, "Therefore, we do not lose heart. Though outwardly we are wasting away, yet inwardly we are being renewed day by day. For our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal weight of glory that far outweighs them all. So we fix our eyes not on what is seen, but on what is unseen, since what is seen is temporary, and what is unseen is eternal." And see, these are the amazing words of someone who knew a lot about suffering. If you study the life of Apostle Paul, he had been shipwrecked and flogged and stoned and imprisoned and persecuted and starved and impoverished. And ultimately he was martyred. He was killed for his faith. And yet he calls all of those things light and momentary troubles. See, what he's saying is that when you put them all of human suffering, all human sorrow, all the tears of human sorrow on one side of the scale, and you put the radiant, unending, eternal goodness that we cannot yet see, but Jesus can see it and says that it is coming. When you put that on the other side, he said, when you put both of those on the scales, eternal glory wins out every time. No contest. And that's the story of the world. Rusty nails pounded into a tree, bringing forth fruit previously unimagined. Such terrible pain bringing such unimaginable glory. And so the question some of you may be asking right now as you go through your own pain, as you go through your own sorrow, is the glory really worth it? Like, is the hope really that big? And the best answer that I can give you is the answer that Jesus gives his disciples on the night that he was going to be betrayed. He's warning them about the time that is to come, but I believe he's not just warning them about the time that was to come, but he's also, in a sense, giving us a picture of all of life that was to come. John 16:20, he says, "Very truly I tell you, you will weep and mourn while the world rejoices. You will grieve, but your grief will turn to joy. A woman giving birth to a child has pain because her time has come. But when her baby is born, she forgets the anguish because of her joy that a child is born into the world. So with you. Now is your time of grief, but I will see you again, and you will rejoice, and no one will take away your joy. Another quick question for the room. Moms in the room. Do you remember having your children? Do you remember the hours of anguish and pain, a type of excruciating pain that you had never ever felt before and that you never ever thought would end? Now, can you imagine that if you were to ask them and they were able to remember and understand at the time what their experience was like, it would probably be similar. While a child is being born, he or she might say, man, what a terrible experience. This is miserable. I'm cold and I'm hungry and I'm helpless and I'm disoriented and I feel like this pain is never, ever going to end. But look at them now. For some of you, those children are already grown up and they're having children and they're having families of their own. And when you compare the hours of labor to the decades of life that follow, is there really any real comparison? Do you really still wonder if it's worth it? Well, some of you might. There's that one kid. I sometimes wonder if it's worth it. Not talking about that one. But the truth is, it's not just about how suffering is going to end one day, even though it is going to end one day. Because the suffering and pain is not just going to end, it's going to be healed as well. It's going to be reversed. It's going to be undone. One of my most favorite moments in the Lord of the Rings trilogy is there's a moment where Gandalf, who is this character who is almost kind of a Christ figure in the books, he dies in the first book and you think he's gone, he's not in the story. And then much later in the story, he comes back and of course he's clothed in white. Tolkien very much used a lot of Christological themes in his book to show this figure, Gandalf, as kind of a Christ figure. And I love, there's one hobbit, one halfling named Samwise Gamgee, that when he sees Gandalf in his resplendent white for the first time again, he says, Gandalf, I thought you were dead. And then he asks this question. I love this so much. He says, is everything sad going to come untrue as well? I love that. And the answer is yes. Someday, maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, maybe not for a while, but yes, someday everything sad is going to come untrue. C.S. Lewis had this wonderful line for it where he believed, and he wrote, and he said that he believed that heaven is, in a sense, going to work backwards because it's already started. It's already begun. It already took and turned the cross, which was this ultimate instrument of violent hate and injustice, into the ultimate expression of triumphant love. And he's going to use that same cross to turn all agony, your agony, my agony, the world's agony, into glory. Endless glory, unimaginable glory, an eternal weight of glory. Christy mentioned before about seeing God's face and like what that meant, seeking his face. I don't think it's a coincidence that at the very end of Revelation, when John the Apostle is describing what life post-suffering will be, one of the primary descriptors is, and we shall see his face. And his joy will be ours, and no one will take that joy away. Amen? Will you stand with me?